All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's video and welcome to the balcony. Okay, we're here at the penthouse today. I've given you a view for today's topic. We're gonna go over propaganda content ad ideas. I'm gonna ensure that you understand real quick the intention of propaganda. Propaganda is intended to help turn your salespeople into cashiers. It's intended to warm up the leads. It's intended to replicate the organic sales process via paid advertising. That's the whole point of propaganda. Rather than just doing standard direct response, we can incorporate propaganda before our direct response, after our direct response, at key points in our sales process, all intended to help people with that next step that they're about to take. I'm gonna specifically today for you focus on somebody who booked a call that's gonna show up for a call. We're gonna talk about that specific part of the process, and I'm gonna give you some categories that you should be filming content ideas for, okay? To be clear, my goal is to help you hit $1 million months. So welcome to the channel. If you're new, subscribe, check out all my other videos. Every single video I've made for you here is dedicated to helping you once again hit $1 million months. So without further ado, let me give you a quick background on this. It was about 10 years ago, I picked up this book by Edward Bernays. It's called Propaganda. And at first, it was a little bit of a conspiracy. You know, I was trying to understand better how I was being essentially like targeted, you know, and what type of content I need to look out for in the world that was potentially trying to manipulate me in order for somebody else's benefit, you know, or just get somebody to make me think a particular way about something, to influence a behavior, you know? And propaganda isn't like some negative, you know, like, oh, it's just a bunch of overlords out there trying to manipulate the way we all think. But at the end of the day, there are people who use it for that. Let me give you an even deeper backstory on how simple this can really be. People need ways to think, okay? A lot of people out there like to think, okay, I come up with thoughts on my own. I have like unique thoughts. I'm pulling thoughts out of my ass. And that's just not how it works. Thoughts are created based on the data that we have in our brain, okay? It's based on experiences, based on content, it's based on conversations we've had with people, it's based on everything that's come through our senses, it's based on the conclusions that we've made, it's based on our beliefs, based on the beliefs of others. Propaganda is just feeding people data, okay? So they can think with that data at a later point. That's all it really is. So our goal with propaganda is to feed people the ways that we want them to think. The intention of propaganda is to increase the probability that they use these things that we're gonna give them to think with to help influence our sales process successfully, okay? When you think of it from that perspective, it naturally becomes a lot easier to start considering what type of propaganda you're gonna need. In terms of the technical how-to here for today's day and age of propaganda and what typically works best, it's important to understand Reels, TikToks, YouTube Shorts, like that format of vertically shot video content that's typically 90 seconds or less. That's generally what, in terms of the most consumption at this point right now in 2024 while I film this for you. And this is a timeless fucking video. It doesn't matter whether it's shorts, reels, or TikToks today and it's long form video content tomorrow. It doesn't matter whether it's the news or whether it's a billboard or whether it's a fucking plane in the sky with a banner on the back of it. If people can see the messaging for whatever is the most effective in the future, that's what we're gonna use to disseminate our propaganda to the people, okay? Now to be clear, tactically for right now, today, once again, I ideally want you filming things in a vertically formatted video. And in addition to that, I ideally want them 90 seconds or less, okay? So to be clear, we ideally want these things, once again, vertical, 90 seconds or less, and optimized for Reels, okay? The reason I say Reels instead of like TikToks and Shorts as my first option is because that's typically where you're gonna spend the most money. Facebook owns Instagram, owns WhatsApp, owns Messenger, owns Oculus. They have the most distribution that typically has your advertisers spending the most money on it because it typically makes the most money out of all the other channels. However, you can take those same short form pieces of content that you drop on Reels, drop them on TikTok, drop them on Shorts as well, because you can do the same thing I'm talking about there. Hell, you could drop this stuff on LinkedIn if you have a B2B demographic and you want to distribute propaganda on that platform as well. You do the same thing on Snapchat. To be clear, once you got the content part of it in terms of how it's formatted out of the way, it's important to note, like, you got to define the audience for who you're going to be talking to, because that also helps prompt you to successfully think with what types of content that specific person needs in that moment. As an example, when we have our pre-ads, okay, these are the people who are seeing content that typically don't know you yet. These are cold audiences. These are people, once again, who just don't know who you are. I love targeting people like that with content. It makes a giant retargeting list available to us in the ad platforms. It makes our direct response ads that much more cost effective. And it also shows us right off the bat, based on who's seeing the content and actually watching it, who's probable to be the most interested in it, which can jack our ROAS up when we actually run our direct response ads to these people. To be clear, we then obviously have our direct response ads. This is typically just for those who are novices with advertising or unfamiliar with my vocabulary terms, my vernacular. Direct response ads are the call to action ads. Those are where you're telling people to go do stuff. Opt in for your webinar, go book a call, go DM you, whatever the hell you're doing. The direct response ads are not content. The direct response ads are ads, okay? Content is content. Common thing that I get people who are only used to running direct response ads asking about content is, what's the call to action? There is no call to action, okay? Content is purely intended to be viewed. Like imagine watching the news from when they're hammering you with propaganda about how to think about the things going on in the world, and they give you call to actions about going out there and like rioting or like protesting or some shit like that. Like they don't give you call to actions. It's just content. It's just intended once again to give you data, to help you think with that data, to manipulate what you're probable to do and how you view the world, okay? Direct response ads are where we make our call to action. So to be clear, that's where we have our CTAs, all right? Now after our direct response ads comes this key framing window, all right? And this is specifically in today's video what I want to focus on with you and what I'd like for you to consider as the key window that can make a substantial difference. If you've watched this week's video already that I dropped on Wednesday, you can go check out the previous one if you look at my videos chronologically, and you'll see, I'm sure my editors are putting it around here somewhere as well. I made a video on paid cold advertising mastery. And in that video, I specifically highlighted how important this specific framing window is. And I hammered why it's important. And I also gave some specific ideas and some executions you could go do in order to help aid you in making $1 million months. From here, as an example, let's use a call funnel for our type of funnel here. Once we run our direct response ads and people actually go book a call, okay? So they've taken that specific action. That's called our pre-call window. Most people on average have about a 72-hour period of time before somebody actually shows up for the call that they booked. The illusion that most businesses have is that the person's already sold and they're therefore going to show up to the call. We do not want to look at it that way. We want to look at it from the perspective of, okay, these people booked a call, so they're interested enough to have booked a call, but they're not interested enough to show up yet. So I need to increase their interest levels enough pre-call in order to not only get them to show up, but to cover that intention we talked about at the beginning of this video. We're trying to turn our salespeople into cashiers, man. We want their job to be as easy as we can possibly make it, okay? So this framing window once again, and then typically from there we have the call, and then after that obviously we have the close, okay? So once again, we're focused on the framing window. Now outside of emails and outside of everything you could do to hammer people from that perspective, once again, we're talking content today. Allow me just real quick before we jump into the ideas, just to explain tactically what you're gonna do here. So you're gonna have the audience set to be the people who just booked, okay? So these are your booked calls. You have to have a minimum of 100 people, okay? A minimum in order to actually get an audience to deliver your ads. There's been some hiccups with people in the EU. I've noticed, the European Union, that based on y'all's laws over there, you guys have some issues about actually being able to target people that take specific actions. So you likely need a greater quantity than 100. You likely need a quantity of at least 300 to 500 from what I've seen from my EU folks out there to be able to actually target the people. Versus everybody else on planet Earth, we get the benefit of having a minimum of 100 folks in there. So as an example, let's say you're not operating at scale yet. Maybe you're doing somewhere between like 100 and 300K a month. Generally, you're not gonna have 100 people within a 72-hour window to be able to target. Remember, we're trying to specifically get in that audience's frame while they are pre-call. So once again, on average, that's usually 72 hours. For some of you guys, especially those of you who are operating at a lower scale, it might be a little less in terms of the time frame. You might be able to get people on the next day. You might be able to, if you have too many reps and not enough calls, they might be able to get it same day. Unfortunately, you're not gonna have as long of a framing window to be able to hammer the fuck out of people, which is what we wanna do. 72 hours is not a bad thing. 48 hours is not a bad thing. 24 hours isn't even a bad thing if you spend enough money to get enough content in front of them and you hammer them with emails too. However, 72 hours is typically the sweet spot for the hammer them strategy. Okay, to be clear, it's important to note that now that we've got this audience defined, okay, now that we've got this 72-hour window here and we've created that audience, once again, the audience being people who booked a call, and we have at least a minimum once again of 100 folks in there. If we don't have 100 folks, we've got to extend it out, okay? So once again, if we do not have that 100, then we got to move it out a little bit, okay? Meaning you might go out as far as like 30 days on this audience, depending on the scale you're operating at and how many calls you're booking in, okay? Most of the people we work with, they're getting 100 calls every 72 hours. Some of them are getting 100 calls every like 7 days. Just depends on where we initially get with them. All the clients doing more than $1 million a month typically are getting 100 calls in 72 hours, okay? But keep in mind, once again, for all the folks that aren't there yet, just take the window and stretch it out a tad. Now, this audience can be set up on two things. It can be set up on a dynamic customer list, okay? Or it can be set up based on a web audience. Now, either one works, but keep in mind, you're typically typically going to get a little bit more people that actually match on a customer list versus a web audience, okay? Web audience meaning people who hit your pixel, those are people that are in your actual website that you've successfully gotten the opportunity to retarget. People who just booked a call as an example and hit your thank you page, okay? Versus a dynamically updating customer list, these are people who also just booked a call, but they're captured via your CRM or whatever scheduler you're using, and you're then sending that data back into the advertising platform. And in addition to that, your marketing automation can remove those people out. If you don't have a CRM that has that functionality, we occasionally find people using some crazy ass softwares. So to be clear, if your CRM doesn't have that advanced functionality, you can always use Zapier to be able to update a customer audience and then be able to remove somebody from a custom audience. You want to remember that this is a dynamically updating list. Like when people book a call, we don't want to keep them in there forever. We want them to be in there for whatever the window is of when they book versus when the time of the call actually happens. So in this case, once again, we want to add them in as soon as they book. We want to remove them 72 hours later, okay? As I mentioned, for those who don't have that 100-person minimum, you might be adding people in there the time they book, and then you might be removing them a week later or 30 days later, whatever it is. Just make sure you take them out besides adding them in, okay? Dynamically updating, that's what we're attempting to do. Now, in terms of content ideas, all right, let's go through this together so we can understand what specifically we want to put in front of people, okay? So number one, and this is the easiest one to typically start with, and this is feedback from salespeople, okay? So I'm talking to one of my Inner Circle students the other day. He's his own salesperson right now. It's actually a CPA. Shout out to Ed if you're watching. He says, you know, my sales process, I don't know, it's just a little hard. Like people aren't showing up super well framed. And I start digging into that with him. I'm like, well, what makes him show up that way? Like what's making it hard? You know, and he starts digging into some very specific things that are occurring on his calls. He says, well, I mean, you know, I'm an accountant, I'm a CPA, and I'm trying to help people lower their tax burden. And I have a very different approach in comparison to the average CPA. So to be clear, I typically can save them a lot of money, and they're not used to that. And they also wonder how I can conclude that they can save that much money with so few questions. He says, I can typically ask them about 6 questions, but that might create some skepticism because they're wondering, well, how the hell are you able to conclude that you can save me that much just based on these few questions that you've asked? So I told him, I said, you know, wouldn't it make a lot of sense, Ed, just based on that set of questions that you've received, to be able to dig a little deeper and be able to start the process of saying, well, why don't I make some content that shows why the average CPA sucks? You know, why don't I make some content that starts to demonstrate why the average accounting firm is costing you tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, or maybe if he's talking to the big dogs, millions of dollars a year in taxes that are paid that could have otherwise been pocketed through proper write-offs. I started telling him some stories specifically about my accounting firm that I work with most recently. They use this term with me called gray area. And what they'll describe is that there are certain things that can and cannot be written off for certain people, but for people like myself, as an example, I make content, I generate business from content, I generate business from being on videos. One thing you'll see if you go to my Instagram, I got my Ferraris, you know, I got the Rolls Royce, and like, I'm posting about it. I use it in the background in my videos sometimes, you know. I'll post it on stories quite frequently. And the reason that is, it's like that demonstrates business usage. So like modern day tax law allows you to write off vehicles if you're a creator and like using them inside of your video content. It doesn't necessarily just have to be the miles driven with the vehicle were solely used for business intent. There's what we call gray area as an example with my accounting firm. And I gave him that as an example and I said, dude, that'd be a great example of a video to be able to demonstrate like some of the things that are technically, like explain gray area. You know, explain that there's certain write-offs that are considered like aggressive. There's certain write-offs that some accountants just won't write, they won't take the deduction, okay? There's certain accountants out there that are more fearful than you of getting audited, you know? And to be clear from that perspective, that'd be a great video. Like demonstrate what gray area is, demonstrate the differences between aggressive accounting firms, gray area accounting firms, and like, man, I don't want to get audited accounting firms, you know? And as an example of that, you know, you could see it clicking in real time. If that person watched that video, Ed's over here thinking, you know, Jeremy, you're totally right, man. Like that make a big difference to how somebody shows up to my call. You see, that's the type of content we're trying to look for when we get feedback from salespeople. Like if they say something like, oh, it's like a little hard, or like there's a big difference between the organic people and the paid ad leads. It's like we want to find those key videos. Okay, so what are those videos that organically can make a difference for a brand? Because remember, propaganda content advertising campaigns, it's very simple to understand. Like they replicate the organic sales process. What happens organically typically over a broad duration of time, an unknown duration of time, an undefined duration of time, is somebody consumes a lot of content, and then eventually they get into the sales process, and the salespeople notice, oh, these people show up really warm, they're very probable to close. In order for us to replicate that via paid advertising, we gotta find what those key videos are. And ideally, we can take the messaging from them. If it's like 30 minutes long as an example, there's not gonna be a lot of people via paid advertising that are gonna watch that. We wanna take that once again and we wanna condense it down to our ideal format of the 90 seconds, vertically formatted. Take the messaging in those key videos and find the key components that are getting people well framed, okay? Take the topics, the concepts, the points that are being made, condense it down to the 90-second vertically formatted videos and start making a few pieces of content like that, okay? Now, to be clear, feedback from salespeople and like those key videos in the organic sales process, these are like the laydown ideas in content, okay? These ones aren't that advanced. They're usually something that you've already like fleshed out and proven, especially if you're already doing a couple $100K a month and trying to hit $1 million months. It's easy to find, it's easy to replicate. Now, to be clear, when we get a little more advanced, okay, we start to get into some categorical pieces of content. So I believe that there's 4 main categories when it comes to content, okay? There's questions that come from those questions, there's objections, and then there's expectations. These categorically, I believe, are what you need to be thinking with when you're making content ideas and then starting the process of distributing propaganda specifically to that framing window audience. So think about this. I did this weekly group call with my inner circle chat, and we all got on and we went through, I think, like 2 or 3 different people's businesses and their offers. And what we did is we acted like there was a direct response ad that was put in front of the group. I had each member that we used as an example articulate what their offer was, and I just made them say some basic information about it, like, here's what my offer is, here's a little bit about how it works. What do you guys think of that? Now, to be clear, I had everybody who showed up on that group call put into the chat, all right, what questions come up as a result of you hearing that direct response ad? And you'd get like anywhere from 10 to like 20 questions that were very like, okay, you need to know this kind of stuff before a call. And some of you guys out there, you might think, oh, well, I put together like a solid VSL that people go watch after a direct response ad, like all those questions are gonna get answered there. And although, yeah, as a best practice, you wanna make sure you put all that in a VSL. If any of you actually look at your video analytics for how many people watch the beginning to the end of your VSLs, you and I both know that they're not consuming that shit, okay? And that's another reason the content helps a lot. We can take the same things that we talk about inside of our VSLs that are answered, and we can put them inside of content. Once again, individual 90-second videos that make that same point that otherwise would have been watched in the VSL in its entirety. Average human retention, by the way, is like 10 to 30% when somebody doesn't immediately take what they learn and write it down or teach it or do something with the information immediately in terms of action. So you can also conclude that even if somebody watches 100% of your VSL, they're retaining about 10 to 30% of it, okay? A tenth to a third, not a lot. So once again, even if you get a high retention rate on your VSLs, take all those key points and put it into videos. Now back to my point, right? We're on this weekly group call. We get a bunch of people that are asking questions about these example offers. And once those questions are getting answered by the person who initially is being used as an example here, articulating their offer to the group, additional questions come up, right? How often does that happen where you get something answered and then immediately there's like 1 to 3 other questions that come up as a result of that answer you got? So that's what I mean by questions that come from the questions. So it's like go through and think, okay, or get feedback from people once again, like do it like what we did in the inner circle chat. Throw your offer out there and get a bunch of people that just articulate back to you like, yeah, here's the questions I'd have about an offer like that, okay? So you get your questions, and then once again, you get questions from those questions. In addition to that, you want to go through your objections. So in terms of objection content, this is very important to understand because this helps a lot. Let's use the example, you get a money objection. Like people are commonly saying, well, I don't have the funds to be able to purchase this yet. And a lot of people that buy your offer use financing as an example. Dude, I don't need to make a piece of content that tells people, well, guess what? You need to come up with the money and be able to buy my shit. It's like, that's a terrible way to handle that. In comparison, I could make a great video that talks about the benefits of financing a course or a business opportunity or some kind of service that can make people money on the other side of it, or that can help solve whatever problem it is or save them time, XYZ. If I can demonstrate in a simple piece of content that financing, even with an excessively high interest rate, much higher than what somebody's gonna pay in your offers, and I just show them math where like it makes sense to break down a big payment into a bunch of smaller payments. That piece of content, guess what? Once again, propaganda-wise, we're giving people data to think with. So when we get somebody to the point where they actually show up to our sales call and they watch that video, there's a higher probability they're going to be willing to finance in comparison to just giving you the objection of like, oh, that's too high of an interest rate. Because keep in mind, if they don't have that data to think with, they're not going to think with it. It's that simple. You see? So we want to take our objections, we want to masterly craft them into pieces of propaganda that can be used in this pre-call process. And then lastly, expectations. So most people who sell something, they have a defined timeline for how long it typically takes to actually achieve a result with that product or service. It's generally not instantaneous, and it's great for you if it is. It generally takes like a couple days, couple weeks, sometimes a couple months in order to get the result. That's great content to distribute, okay? The expectations of your offer. What is required of the people that you're actually working with, okay? Because it's never just, in most instances, they get it and don't have to do shit after. In most instances, there's something that the client has to do as well. Even if it's just as simple as making themselves available for a short call or allowing somebody into their home or something like that. You get my point? Seeing an email or two. Expectations equals success. So if we cover these 4 categories successfully, and once again, we format them into 90-second vertically formatted videos, we have 2 options from there. We can post them straight to our Instagram account, we can post them straight to our YouTube, straight to our TikTok, straight to our LinkedIn, and then we can use the option in our advertising platforms to use an existing post rather than using a dark post. Dark post meaning we don't have to post these on our feed. We can just go right into the ads manager and we can take that content and run it without people having to see it on the front end of our page. Okay? And sometimes that's beneficial, sometimes it makes more sense to post on the page, that's why I bring up both. We'll typically have people post it on the page, and then to be clear, that benefits the organic process as well. Moral of the story is 90-second, vertically formatted, post to the page, or don't, up to you. From there, you get the audiences created, people who booked a call in this case, get the web audience set up, get the customer list set up, and make sure it's dynamic once again. People go in after they book, people get removed after a certain amount of time. Pro tip, again, make sure if you're in the United States or anywhere else in the world besides the EU, get at least 100 people in that audience. So it might not be 72 hours, it might be a week, it might be 30 days. In addition to that, once again, if you're in the EU, you typically need about 300 to 500 people in that audience. You might have to go a little further out, depending on, once again, when you achieve that quantity of people in that specific audience that we're talking about. Now, tactically, last thing, okay? This is very important. You want to make sure that you set up an exclusion once somebody watches that specific video, okay? So to be clear, as soon as somebody watches 3 seconds of that thing, they should never see it again, ever, okay? That way, they see all the other videos that you've created in your propaganda campaign. Now, to be clear, if you want additional tactics, know-how, the how-tos on all this fun stuff, you want content ideas, you want to be able to go into our inner circle group and put your offer out there and get a bunch of feedback from a bunch of high-level people that are going to give you ideas for all this fun stuff. You want to join into my inner circle program. To be clear, link in the description. We do twice a month one-on-one calls, weekly group calls like we've talked about, quarterly masterminds here in person. In addition to that, we have a group chat. Most recent, we're at 16 people for this specific month that have just joined in. Most recent 16 people, lowest one was doing 140K, highest one was doing 900K a month. It's a bunch of heavy hitters and we'd love to have you involved if you're, once again, somebody that's rich trying to get a hell of a lot richer. It aids you a tremendous amount when you're on your path to hit $1 million months. And at the least, whether you take action on that or not and join in, look man, my whole channel's dedicated to helping guys and girls like you go out there and hit $1 million months. So check out some of my other videos, drop some feedback in the comments, like it, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in another video. Go make some money.